Welcome to the Data Room, where we share best practices and actionable tips on being a data-driven company, or as we call it, data first. If you're a B2B revenue leader looking to scale your growth stage business, come and join experienced CEO and tech founder Scott Stouffer in the Data Room. Welcome back to another episode of the Data Room. I am Heather Kitos, and I'm here with Scott Stouffer, co-founder and CEO of scaleMatters. And today I want to talk about something that is top of mind probably for a lot of companies coming into the end of the year and even 2022, brand building. And it can definitely seem daunting for an early stage or even a growth stage company to build their brand. And I want to focus today on an important aspect of brand building because there's a lot. We could probably spend more episodes and all the minutes on it. But let's focus today on figuring out the optimal way to position yourself in relation to your perceived competition. So, Scott, I love to spend some time today, given your experience running and founding multiple companies. Can you share why it's so important to nail your competitive positioning?
Sure. Great topic. So how you position yourself with respect to competition essentially establishes the way or the context within which prospective buyers are going to evaluate you or evaluate your offerings. So if the positioning is murky, it kind of leaves the buyer confused and it makes their process of evaluation very inefficient. If the positioning is clear but uninspiring, it leaves the buyer underwhelmed. In either case, suboptimal competitive positioning depresses win rates and it elongates sales cycles, neither of which are good, of course. So the goal of great positioning, there's really two. One is to allow the buyer to efficiently evaluate your offerings. And very few people keep this top of mind when they're working on your positioning, but you got to make it easy for buyers to be able to evaluate you. But the second thing, which is just as important, is great positioning allows the buyer to reach a conclusion that your offering is meaningfully differentiated from alternative offerings and that the value of that differentiation to the prospective buyer is immense. So you want to have positioning that makes it easy to evaluate you, but when the evaluation is done, it basically shines light on how you're different and that those differences come off as extremely valuable to the buyer. So the first part of getting your competitive positioning right is to actually have a very clear understanding of your competitors. And in the B2C world, this generally isn't super hard because you can typically sign up for competitors' offerings. Right. That's not so easy to do in the B2B world, where competitive offerings may be either prohibitively expensive to purchase for research purposes, or you might not even be able to get access to them. So without a good understanding of your competitors, it's very difficult to have the foundation to guide your own positioning. And as a side note, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. I've seen time and again where companies, even companies that I was running, don't really understand their competitors' capabilities and value propositions. And as a result, their salespeople are sort of left to essentially make it up on the fly. And when speaking with an informed prospect, that can actually have a catastrophic impact because the salesperson's credibility is immediately shot if the customer calls BS on it. So it's important, not just from a positioning perspective, but also from a credibility perspective, to actually have a good handle on your competitors. But in addition to just sort of the difficulty of accessing competitive products to better understand them, for many earlier stage companies, they may not actually have any legitimate direct competitors, right? Because what they're doing is so novel, and this creates its own set of challenges. So for most of us, the way our brain works is we actually want to put new information into boxes that we already know. It's what gives us context to evaluate that new information. Otherwise, our brains sort of need to work too hard. So for early stage companies with something novel, it's important in your positioning to introduce adjacent boxes that the buyer knows, so they can at least start to narrow the context of their evaluation. But you still then sort of have to have that fine balance of ensuring that he or she doesn't just dump you into one of those boxes, because then you don't necessarily come off as novel as you might actually be. The second key ingredient in nailing competitive positioning is to actually have a very crisp understanding of what's important to the prospective buyers who match your ideal profile. Because successfully differentiating against competitors on issues that aren't actually important to the buyers, it isn't really helpful, because it doesn't really raise the perceived value of your offering at all. And this can be challenging as you scale, because senior leadership teams, who are typically the ones responsible for things like positioning and messaging and product roadmap, they become further and further removed from the prospects, and therefore their previous intimate understanding of those prospects begins to actually diminish.
That is a great point. First, not only just about relating, or I guess your second point about relating your offering in relation to things that are familiar to your prospects, but two, like, where are you in how you stand next to your competitors? I don't think a lot of companies take the time to do that. You've definitely made it clear that getting your positioning right is super important, predominantly because it maximizes, or it can help maximize win rate and propel velocity. And then clearly through your explanation, it's a little difficult to do, right? To achieve and maintain that really intimate understanding of both who your competitors are and what they're doing, as well as your prospective customers and what they're doing, and what's important to them. So do you have any tips on how to overcome those challenges and really build that understanding?
Yeah, there's no easy way. It's hard work, but it's important work. And of course, the classic way to gain competitive understanding is somehow to gain access to their offerings so that you can evaluate them firsthand. And as mentioned earlier, this can be straightforward in B2C, not so much in B2B, though. I think a good place to start is the review sites like Software Advice or G2 or Capterra and so on. You can't necessarily take what you learn there literally because there's so much institutional effort by the vendors to actually suppress modest reviews and incent their customers to post glowing reviews. So the information is very biased, but you can find morsels that can lay the foundation for your initial positioning attempt. What I like to call your hypothesis positioning, that then kicks off the iterative process of optimizing it. But then I'd say the quickest way to actually strengthen your competitive understanding is to structure your sales conversations in a way that are intentional, in the way that they solicit more knowledge and feedback on competitive offerings. And many companies miss the boat here because their sales conversations aren't intentional. They aren't intentional to encourage prospect engagement. So they rarely learn as much as they could have by simply being more intentional about that goal. But even if they do learn important information from competitors, that knowledge rarely makes it out of the head of the salesperson and becomes institutional, because there hasn't historically been a very efficient way of capturing it and spreading it within the organization. Sure. However, there is good news. Kind of with the combination of COVID-driven remote sales and the recently emergent tool set that we, kind of the newer generation of call recording tools, which are sort of called conversation intelligence, two examples being Gong and Chorus. Best-in-class companies have gotten particularly good at exploiting these tools to capture and institutionalize the information from sales conversations that leads to much deeper competitive understanding across the organization. So that's one tip, all right, or two tips actually. Start with the G2s and Software Advices, just see what you can learn so you can do some hypothesis positioning, or if you will. But then commit to the tools and infrastructure to actually make your sales calls intentional so that you can extract this data, but commit to the tools and infrastructure to actually bring that in-house and institutionalize it. And the same really holds true when it comes to gaining more intimate understanding of the prospects themselves and what's important to them. It's the same thing, right? If you're trying to learn and trying to gain understanding, then you need to be intentional with the structure of your sales conversation so that they basically adroitly extract this information from the prospects. And then ideally, again, you'd leverage conversation intelligence tools and analytic tools on top of that to basically capture this unstructured data and turn it into something that's statistically useful to help guide your iterations on your positioning. So I guess summary, given that competitive understanding and prospect understanding are critical to achieving great positioning, best practices says be intentional on the sales conversation so that you can ferret out information you don't have. Leverage tools and technology to institutionalize that information so that it becomes available for the leaders that have to actually then iterate on the positioning.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. If you're intentional and all these conversations are happening, a lot of people are just willing to share their pain points and what's important to them, as long as you ask, and long as you have a plan to ask and kind of dive into that deeper. But then on top of that, like you said, if you have a conversational tool, intelligence tool like Gong or Chorus, use that to your advantage. Then you don't have to worry on relying on the salespeople to extract that information from their own head into your CRM. So I think those are great tips, Scott. I think those are really actionable tips that if you are kind of brand building and you don't know where to start, the idea of hypothesis positioning and then iterating based on what you find and using data to figure out what your positioning is a great way to tackle that. I think if you are a listener of this podcast and you're still trying to figure out how to really implement that, what we might call even like voice of prospect data to propel your kind of go-to-market process, go to scaleMatters.com/assessment. We have a data maturity assessment for listeners of this podcast. You can kind of figure out where you are in your data journey. So scalematters.com/assessment. And Scott, these are really good tips. So thank you so much. And we'll see you again in the data room.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather.